Hi everyone. In our previous class, we were talking about the good neighbor policy and how the United States basically made changes to its own approach towards Central America for their benefit because of the Great Depression and because of the World War II. So in our previous class, we briefly discussed about those two different aspects. But today we're going to be looking at what particularly happened after the 1930s, in the 1940s, as it relates in particular to the Great Depression and World War II and its impact to or in Central America. So today's class is titled Demands for Change, and Demands for Change particularly relates to the impact of the Great Depression and World War II on Central America and Central American politics and Central America economics as well. So today we're going to be looking at two different things. One, we're going to examine the impact of the Great Depression and World War II on Central America. And two, we're going to justify the claims in Central America for reform. Now, if you recall from our previous classes, we speak about reform as asking for change. So you're pressuring the government to see how they could change their policies or they could change their approach in relation to a particular issue. So Central America was going through a phase in which people were starting to fight for change. They were starting to protest, they were starting to organize themselves, new political parties were coming about, and all of this was particularly because they want to change. In other words, you have the poor people wanting land, you have the middle class wanting jobs, you have the middle class also wanting representation, and even the aristocrats in this case wanting some sort of economic backing to their interests. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to discuss the Great Depression and World War II, and particularly its impact. So what is the Great Depression and what is World War II? I think World War II needs limited description because many of you should already know what is World War II. However, the Great Depression is something that we have not necessarily discussed, although you should have discussed it in second form. So the Great Depression occurred in 1921, and it is doomed, or it is called the Great Depression, because the stock market basically crashed, and once the stock market crashed, the industrialized world crashed with it as well. So the economy went down, and the United States is a world power. It's an economic force as well. So when the United States economy went down, it was felt throughout the region. So you have imbalances in exports and imports, you have banks closing down, you have different other things happening within the United States that eventually impact the rest of Central America. On the other hand, you also had World War II. World War II was something that occurred from 1939 to 1945. And World War II basically, or the immediate cause for it, was because Germany invaded Poland, and then Britain and the French reacted, declaring war on Germany. So there were two different groups that were fighting. You have the Axis, which included Germany, Italy, and Japan, and you have the Allied forces, which included Britain, the USA, the Soviet Union, and France. So you see two different forces and two different views fighting to gain control of the world. In this case, we all know, or we should know by now, that the Allied forces won and Germany was defeated. So that's the end of World War II. So both the Great Depression and World War II, in a way, occurred uh, close to each other. So if you're talking about time frames, you're talking about the Great Depression and its effects in the 1930s, and then immediately in the end of the 1930s you have World War II starting as well. So both of these things brought catastrophic effects towards Central America. So it did not only bring these effects towards Central America, it also brought effects towards British Honduras, which is Belize. So what were some of these effects? As you all know, and as I had stated earlier, because the economy of the United States declined, banks began to close, people began to be laid off, and people began to be looking for employment. There was widespread unemployment, there was widespread hunger. So the United States was in a way crumbling down because of this Great Depression. So in addition to that, or we could say as a consequence of that, you see that the economies of Central America also begin to feel the same impact. So as you can see, the US investments from 1929 to 1944 declined by as much as 50%. So you could imagine that in Central America, you have big plantations being closed down, you have big companies being closed down. And the economies of Central America, which were for so long dependent on foreign investment, were now becoming stagnant. in a way, guys, this sort of relates to what is happening in Belize, because we have so much dependency on foreign investment and foreign investors that if one day that is missing, we could be running into serious trouble. So as you can see, Central America began to suffer again widespread poverty, which was already there. So there was another level of poverty being placed in Central America. The middle class also began to suffer, because you're talking about the middle class workers. They are now becoming laid off, they're becoming unemployed, and everyone begins to suffer in Central America. The governments, on the other hand, begin to think particularly on protecting the biggest or the big industries. In this case, the government begins to create a sense of institute, or a series of institutes, sorry, and within these institutes they begin to protect the coffee industry. However, there is something important to note about this, that when they protect the coffee investments and they protect the coffee companies, what they are protecting indirectly are the rich elite people who are controlling the coffee industry as well. So to an extent, it justifies, one, that they're the effects of the Great Depression justifies that they're protecting the rich people, and that they are now to an extent creating a larger poorer class, but they're not necessarily caring for the interests of the poorer class. So obviously, as you may know, with all of these things happening, with the protection of the coffee industry, widespread unemployment, hunger in Central America, people are becoming desperate. That is when you see that there is a rise of people. So the unemployed people, the people that are underpaid now, begin to organize themselves, and they begin to argue for some reforms, particularly because they want representation, particularly because they want improvements as it relates to being workers. So the laborers began to organize themselves, they began to agitate, and there were four major things that were occurring. First, the middle class wanted for elections. As you recall in our previous classes, Central America was governed by dictators throughout. And at this point in the 1940s, 50s, Central America is now fighting for elections to happen and for democracy to come into Central America. Secondly, you saw that the workers, also the ones who were working, wanted the abuses to stop. They wanted social security, they wanted the right to strike, and they wanted an 8-hour day work. In other words, 8 hours per day for them to work. So to an extent, these things that we seem to think that were some that we take for granted were something that they were fighting for yet. And of course, guys, the poor people wanted land. On a whole, we could say that the intellectual class in Central America and the middle class in Central America wanted a social transformation where everything would change. The political approach would change, the social approach would change, the economic approach would also change. So all of this was being brought up by the Great Depression and World War II. So as a result of that, you see that new political parties were created. You also see that because of the pressure that these dictators were facing, they did not like that idea. So dictatorships disliked the ideas that people were being organized, that people were protesting. In fact, what they began to do is that they began to undermine all of those protests by stating that any of those protests would equal to a revolution. Coupled with that was the US interests that they were fighting communism at this point in Central America. So it is very important to note about this. Why? Because the USA's idea of fighting communism became one of their main interests, or one of the main reasons for them to fund military activity in Central America, and for them to actually send their Marines to stop any revolution in Central America, any revolution that would fight for the rights of the people. Very important things. So as you can see, the Great Depression and World War II had a massive impact on Central America. So what I want you to do for this week in particular, and this will be due on Thursday, is to create a cartoon representation. So what do you visually see as the main effect of the Great Depression and World War II on Central America? And I want you to, one, create a cartoon, which doesn't really have to be a work of art. You all know that it could be stickman, and what I'm looking for is how well you conceptualize an idea. And I want you to attach to it as well some description to it. So that's all I want you to do for this week. Thank you.